In previous videos, I've covered a couple noteworthy German pre-dreadnoughts. Hessen, Pommern, and the big one, Schleswig-Holstein. Those are the famous names, though I suppose only the final one can truly be considered famous, due to her actions at the start of the Second World War. However, there's another battleship I want to touch on today, Schleswig-Holstein's partner in crime as it were, SMS Schlesien, the other pre-dreadnought to survive in active combat use into the Second World War, and in fact the one to slightly outlast any other, including her more famous sister. Granted, her end would be an unfortunate one, but that can be said for every German warship of the period, even the ones that otherwise survived the war. That said, we won't be reaching that point for a while. Before we can get to this, we have both the design and Schlesien's early service to touch on. The latter will be longer than the former for a fairly obvious reason. Schlesien, as noted, was a sister to Schleswig-Holstein, and by extension to Pommern. That means I've covered this design a couple times already, so I won't linger long here today. Now when I get around to Deutschland herself, that'll be a different story. For the moment, a brief look at the design, starting, as per usual, with the displacement. Schlesien displaced around 13,200 tons at the normal load. The full load was around 14,200 tons. That displacement came mostly from armor and weaponry. We'll start with the weapons, with this being the traditional 4 big guns and 2 twin turrets, not the usual 12-inch 305mm in this example. Instead, it was the German quirk of 28cm 11-inch guns. Schlesien carried 4 of those and a twin turret on the bow and a twin turret on the stern, with these supported by no fewer than 14 17cm 6.7-inch secondary guns in single casement mountings, as well as 20 88mm guns, the usual swarm of lighter weaponry, as well as the obligatory 6 submerged torpedo tubes. In this case, 1 in the bow, 1 in the stern, and 2 on either broadside. For its part, the armor was average by this point, 240mm 9.4 inches for the main belt, thinning down to 100mm 3.9 inches on the bow and the stern, with another German quirk in 80mm 3.1 inches of teak backing the armor up. Above this, the casement armor came out to 170mm 6.7 inches thick, while the deck was 40mm 1.6 inches. With all of this capable of up to 19 knots on 17,000 indicated horsepower through 3 shafts, thus rounding off the design details. Now let's talk the early service, which started rather late by pre-dreadnought standards. Schlesien was laid down in Danzig on November 19, 1904. Around a year and a half later, on May 28, 1906, she would be launched, and commissioned another 2 years later on May 5, 1908. Due to entering service so late, Schlesien was obsolescent from the moment she touched the water. Some would argue she was outright obsolete, and they wouldn't be wrong. This is reflected in the ship's service, because, as is fairly typical for German pre-dreadnoughts, it was mostly quiet. Though, for Schlesien, she at least had a slight detour from the norm. For most German warships of this period, they would have their sea trials interrupted, primarily by escorting the Kaiser around his yacht. While Schlesien would have her trials disrupted as well, it wasn't for that reason. Instead, it was for use as a torpedo training ship from July 6th to September 5th. Beyond this, there's not really much to note for the pre-war service. While Schlesien properly joined the German fleet by the end of 1908, there wasn't exactly much to do. And much of what she did do, well, I've covered that in detail several times by now. This isn't to say Schlesien did nothing, of course. She was kept quite busy from 1908 through 1914. It's just that none of it stands out from her sisters. The same voyages into the Baltic or the Atlantic, the same fleet reviews, and the same training duty. So, with this in mind, let's go ahead and move on to 1914, when things began to actually change. For the German fleet as a whole, if not for Schlesien in specific. Once more, her service with her sisters in the 2nd Battle Squadron is going to sound very familiar to those who have watched my previous videos. Because when the Great War broke out in July 1914, Schlesien was still with her 2nd Squadron sisters, initially assigned to guard duty where they protected the mouth of the Elbe River. When the British committed to a distant blockade, however, the situation changed. The old battleships were sent back to the High Seas Fleet proper, for another quirk of Imperial German doctrine. You see, they recognized their distinct lack of numbers. Despite the rush of the naval arms race, the British outnumbered the Germans in dreadnoughts and in battlecruisers. To try and solve this issue, the Germans would take the most modern of their pre-dreadnoughts along for planned fleet actions. The ships were slow and undergunned, relatively speaking, but they still brought heavy armor and 4 big guns each, and to the German mind, that was at least something. Or so the theory went, though in fairness, those ships really weren't up to much in a pitched fleet battle. With this in mind, Schlesien and the other 2nd Battle Squadron ships set sail on December 15th, 1914, as part of a larger German formation sent out to support the Große in their first raid on Britain. As I noted in the Pommern video, this would be a massive missed opportunity. The High Seas Fleet came within 20 kilometers, 10 nautical miles, of 6 British battleships. Before pulling away, missing their chance at the take a bite out of the Grand Fleet plan that was the underpinning of the entire naval war. With that missed opportunity behind her, Schlesien returned to guard duty, with a break in March of 1916 to once again be used for torpedo target duty, this time to train U-boats. I suppose she at least had experience in this. That said, soon after, the ship would get her final chance at the Grand Fleet. On May 29th, she joined the rest of the German fleet in sailing for the Battle of Jutland, though once again, Schlesien would miss most of the action. As I noted, the pre-dreadnoughts were notably slower than the newer battleships. Because of this, the 2nd Squadron would only show up to the main battle for the night phase. This would see Schlesien join her sisters in covering the retreat of the Große. This was, in fairness, a daring move, It drew British fire upon the old pre-dreadnoughts, letting the battered battlecruisers make their escape. However, Schlesien would be unable to properly engage the British. Her contribution was mostly serving as a target, taking some minor splinter damage in the process. Still quite a bit better than Pommern, sunk in catastrophic fashion in the night destroyer attacks. That loss and the general ineffectiveness of the pre-dreadnoughts saw Schlesien relegated to second-line duty after Jutland, be it as a guard ship, an icebreaker, or a target ship. Eventually, the pre-dreadnought was taken completely out of active duty and reduced to a training ship in 1918, including a refit that saw her main and secondary battery removed for use ashore. She would instead be used in the Baltic for training to round off the war. With a detour on November 5th, 1918, during the Kiel Mutiny, when Schlesien's crew stayed loyal. They sailed the mostly disarmed ship from Kiel, while a large portion of the fleet refused to do anything. They most especially refused the so-called death ride for the honor of the fleet. Schlesien would not have been involved with this regardless. Instead, the crew sailed their ship to a different port where she would be decommissioned by the end of November. With the armistice on November 11th, 1918, there was no apparent need for the ship in service. This would probably have been where her story ended in most circumstances. However, the Treaty of Versailles would change that. Germany was only allowed to retain a handful of pre-dreadnought battleships, a consolation prize as it were, because those ships were no real threat. Though for coast defense in the Baltic, they still had some limited utility. The German fleet, now the Reichsmarine, could keep 8 of these ships, 6 in service and 2 in reserve. Of those, only 4 were ever in operation at any one time, and the 2 ships in reserve were never reactivated at all. Even getting the active ships back into service took some time. Of those, only Hanover was still fully armed and operational. The rest had been reduced to various secondary roles, such as the mostly disarmed Schlesien. Rearming and refitting the ships would take some time, with Schlesien in particular not rearmed and modernized until the late 1920s. She was taken in hand in 1926 with the old 28cm guns fitted back aboard, or at the least equivalent guns from stockpiles. However, the original secondary battery would not be available. The Germans had already used up their stock of existing 17cm guns and did not have more to hand. Instead, they opted for lighter 15cm 5.9-inch guns on a 1-to-1 basis in the old casements, while the tertiary battery was reduced to 8 guns in the superstructure. A superstructure that, for its own part, was also modified. The forward funnel was removed with the exhaust trunked into a larger second funnel. This was now the first funnel, with the formerly third, now second one, raised up a bit. Her masts were also modified during this overhaul. With the work finished by the end of 1927, at which point Schlesien returned to German service, now the flagship of Germany's remaining battleships. A prestigious title, to be sure, though in fairness, Germany's battleships were 4 outdated relics. Outdated relics that were, by and large, kept close to home, training in the Baltic to at least keep a core of experienced sailors in the fleet, with the odd voyage into the Atlantic as well for more further afield training. Or, if you prefer, she was right back to what the ship had done before the Great War, only differing in her now expanded flagship duties, something that saw Schlesien go on a voyage to Italy in 1930, which was at least a change of pace. Not much else would happen beyond this point into the early 1930s. Schlesien continued on her training duty before being replaced on December 10, 1933 as the Flagship by the new Panzerschiff Deutschland, a ship bearing the name of Schlesien's long since scrapped sister ship. As for the old Battleship, she spent her time puttering about training sailors before being taken off the line in 1935 for a more extensive modernization. This saw the ship's boilers torn out, replaced by new and much more efficient models. The aft 8 in particular were replaced by oil-fired models. The forward boiler room, meanwhile, was emptied out and converted to accommodation space for cadets. The forward funnel lost its trunking as a result, making it easier to tell Schlesien from Schleswig-Holstein. Once the refit was done, the battleship would go on several long-distance voyages, from Cape Verde to the Americas, with the latter voyage including rounding Cape Horn, a dangerous job no matter the ship, though good training. That said, her most notable event was a visit to Ireland, specifically to Cork on February 25, 1939. This is notable not for anything the ship or her crew did, but for the fact the mayor, one James Hickey, refused to greet the Germans. The man was, as it turned out, a devout Catholic, at a time when German relations with the Vatican were strained, to put it mildly. As the German press had been rather insulting in the aftermath of Pope Pius XI's death, Hickey saw no need to welcome a German ship. It was rather widely reported on at the time for the snub that it was. However, this was also February of 1939. World events, including for Schlesien, would soon overtake an Irish snub of a German ship. For Schlesien, this would be similar again to Schleswig-Holstein. The latter ship is better known, of course, for firing the first rounds of the Second World War when she bombarded Polish positions around Danzig on September 1st, 1939. However, Schlesien would join her sister in firing on the Poles in September. The two old ships still had their main batteries, and for shore bombardments, this was perfectly sufficient. Schlesien, in particular, bombarded targets from September 21st to the 27th of 1939. After this, though, the ship was taken off the line, relegated with her sister back to training duty, or alternatively as an icebreaker, with most of the secondary guns pulled off to arm surface raiders. Nothing particularly surprising about this, simply because the ships were thoroughly obsolete. If there was a surprise in the Second World War, it's how often Schlesien ping-ponged from active to secondary duty. For example, she had stints in use supporting the invasion of Denmark in April 1940, or being stationed off the Danish coast as a guard ship in June 1941, to block any attempt by the Soviets to send their fleet out, presuming, of course, that the Luftwaffe didn't sink the ships first. When this didn't come to pass, Schlesien reverted to training and icebreaker duty for the majority of the war, though this began to become less and less common as the war ground on. Unlike Schleswig-Holstein, Schlesien lacked any coal-fired boilers, and Germany, suffice it to say, had much more important uses for its shrinking oil supply than an old battleship. As such, by late 1944, the ship was largely confined to port, though fairly bristling with light anti-aircraft weaponry. Sources will differ, but it was somewhere around 10 40mm guns and 22 20mm cannon, as well as some 37mm weapons, along with 4 to 6 10.5cm guns. Regardless of the exact number, Schlesien, also fitted with radar by this point, remained on second-line work, until, that is, March of 1945, by which point she was the final German battleship afloat. Her sister was sunk in port. Scharnhorst and Bismarck were on the bottom. Gneisenau was a wreck, and Tirpitz was capsized. Even the remaining Panzerschiff were out of action, leaving old Schlesien to soldier on for shore bombardment. From March 15th to the 21st of 1945, she provided support for German forces. Then she evacuated 1,000 wounded men before continuing her shelling duty into May, where her story finally came to an end. On May 3rd, Schlesien struck a mine. While the destroyer Z-39 towed her to port, the old battleship was left in place, not worth repairing, and eventually scuttled as the war wound down. The last of Germany's battleships, a venerable old pre-dreadnought, would be scrapped over the 1950s, though some remnants survived into the 1970s. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.